Story 1. People often find it peculiar when I tell them what I do for a living. I suppose working in a morgue isn't a popular career choice. Most think of forensic doctors, but few consider those of us who prepare the deceased so their loved ones can say a final goodbye. I specialize in thanatoaesthetics, meaning I am responsible for grooming and preparing the deceased before their funeral. I like to think my work brings some comfort to grieving families. I always strive to do my best and treat the deceased with respect. I never planned on doing this job for years. It was more of a series of coincidences. My older sister started working at a funeral home in the administrative department, but became interested in morgue work. She convinced me to study thanatoaesthetics, though she abandoned it after the first term. However, I found it fulfilling and dignified. I don't scare easily, and I feel a strange sense of peace, knowing that one day someone will prepare me for my own farewell. After completing my studies, I got a job at a well-known funeral home. I gained experience quickly and stayed there for many years. I have countless memories from that place. Some families make unusual requests. Once, a family asked us to place sliced lemons inside the deceased's socks. We did as requested, but I never learned why. I was content with my job, but when I received an offer with better pay elsewhere, I accepted. Now, I regret that decision. It was another funeral home. On my first day, I learned that my predecessor had only lasted a couple of months. My new colleagues had also been there for a short time. They showed me around, and everything seemed normal until we reached the morgue. I admit that in this line of work, you sometimes feel certain energies. I believe these are just traces of the soul left behind in the body, a natural occurrence. But in this new place, the energy felt different. It was heavy. Many of my colleagues might not believe in such things, but I consider myself spiritual. I'm certain something was off about that place. The first person I prepared was an elderly woman who had died of natural causes. We always receive a report with details about the deceased, along with clothing chosen by their family, and one or two photographs to guide the preparation. I dressed the woman in a plum-colored suit and styled her hair and makeup to match the photo. To finish, I applied color to her lips and turned away to organize my materials. When I glanced back, her lips were pale. I didn't understand. I just applied color. I reapplied it and watched closely. Just then, my coworker, responsible for preserving the body, entered and asked if I was nearly done. I said yes and looked at the woman's face again. Her lips were pale once more. My coworker noticed my reaction and asked if something was wrong. Though tempted to tell him, I decided against it. I didn't want to make a bad impression on my first day. I applied the lipstick a third time. This time the color stayed. I told no one about the incident and nearly forgot about it until a month later when something even stranger happened. This time I wasn't the only witness. We were working on the last body of our shift, a man in his 50s who had died in an accident. It was a long process, as our goal is always to make the deceased look as their loved ones remembered them. Just as we were about to finish, the lights flickered off and on for a second. My coworker and I exchanged confused looks. Perhaps there was a power outage in the area, but the backup generator should have kicked in. After all, the morgue requires a stable temperature. We finished preparing the body when the lights went out again. This time, they didn't come back on. We were in complete darkness. I fumbled for my phone under my work uniform. My coworker mentioned seeing light outside, so we stepped into the hallway. The corridor was still illuminated. He went to speak with security while I waited by the door, trying to find any news online about power outages, but there was nothing. Minutes later, my coworker returned. The guard had checked the generator and maintenance was on its way. Suddenly, the lights returned before the maintenance team had even arrived. Relieved, we re-entered the morgue to finish up, but the body was gone. My coworker and I stood frozen in disbelief. Then there was a knock at the door. It was the security guard. He informed us maintenance would take longer, but insisted on checking for any significant damage. Before I could stop myself, I blurted out, "The body is gone!" Silence. We decided to search the morgue. I knew the refrigerator drawers were empty. We only used them when multiple bodies arrived on the same day, but I checked anyway. For the first time in my career, I felt fear. My hands were clammy. I opened each drawer, bracing myself. Nothing. The body had vanished. We hurried to the security room to review the footage. First, we watched the corridor camera. It showed my coworker and me stepping out. Then we checked the morgue feed. Everything looked normal. The lights flickered once, then went out completely. When the camera switched to night vision, the body was gone. We replayed it, unable to believe our eyes. One moment, the body was there. The next, after the blackout, the table was empty. There was no logical explanation. Then the security guard suggested we check footage from the storage room, the only other place where the power had also gone out completely. Just then, the entrance buzzer rang. Maintenance had arrived. While the guard attended to them, my coworker and I headed to the storage room, where the coffins were kept. We started opening them, feeling ridiculous. Then my coworker called out. One of the coffins was slightly ajar. He lifted the lid. Inside was the missing body. We had no rational explanation for what happened that night. A month later, my coworker quit. The security guard also left after a few months. Rumors spread. New security officers would sometimes ask if we had ever seen anything strange. One even claimed to hear noises from the morgue at night. I stayed for nearly 2 years. I never saw anything like that again. But I always felt something different in that place. Story 2. When I was in college, I got my first job at a cafe in my hometown, Los Michos. On my first day, I met the woman who would train me. She was kind, and we quickly became friends. That night, she told me about strange occurrences at the cafe, including the voice of a little girl. I dismissed it as a joke meant to scare me. Days passed without anything unusual, confirming my skepticism. One afternoon, I arrived early at work and brought food for my coworker and me. While we were chatting, 2 customers entered. One of them asked to use the bathroom. After some time, I assumed he had finished, so I went to change into my uniform. When I tried to open the bathroom door, it was locked. The man told me he hadn't used the bathroom because someone was inside. Shocked, I told him that was impossible. Only my coworker and I were in the cafe. He insisted, saying that when he knocked, a little girl had answered, saying it was occupied. My coworker and I exchanged nervous glances. To prove no one was inside, I grabbed the bathroom keys and unlocked the door. Just as we expected, it was empty. The customer was in disbelief, but we chose not to discuss it further. After he left, my coworker admitted they were used to such occurrences. Though unnerved, I tried to forget about it. Months passed without further incidents until Halloween night. I always felt safe at work because my boss arrived at 8 p.m. to stay until closing. But that night, she was late. I wasn't too concerned because there were still customers. When she finally arrived, I felt relieved until she told me she had errands to run and was leaving me alone. I distracted myself by playing music and chatting with 2 older women in the cafe. They claimed to know my boss and her family, even naming each member. They said they attended the same church, so I saw no reason to doubt them. Then they started asking personal questions, including whether I had a boyfriend. I told them I was dating someone and really liked him. One of them asked if I wanted to marry him. When I said yes, she looked into my eyes and said, "You won't marry him." I laughed, assuming it was a joke, but when she didn't laugh back, my smile faded. She repeated that I wouldn't be able to marry him. I ignored her and continued cleaning, but she called me again. I responded politely, and she warned me not to be scared because she could see things and someone was standing behind me. Annoyed, I dismissed her words. Shortly after, the women left. Alone again, I turned up the music and resumed cleaning. Then something fell. I turned and saw my stapler on the floor, even though I had left it far from the edge of the counter. I brushed it off until I heard the bathroom door slam shut. I ran to check and the door was locked. Now truly frightened, I ran out of the cafe. Outside, I ran into a security guard who asked if I was okay. Trembling, I explained what had happened. We both looked toward the cafe and saw the lights flickering on and off. We stood frozen in shock. I didn't want to go back inside, but I had to. Summoning my courage, I asked the guard to keep an eye on me. I left the doors open and tried to finish cleaning as quickly as possible. Then a strong wind blew through the cafe, and the lights shut off. Through the speakers, a little girl's voice whispered, "Come play with me." Terrified, I collapsed onto the floor crying. I heard footsteps approaching, but was too scared to look. Then I heard my boss's voice. I ran to her and hugged her tightly. She calmed me down, made me tea, and encouraged me to explain what had happened. I started by telling her about the two women, insisting that they claimed to know her. She immediately denied it, saying she would have recognized them if they attended her church. But when I told her they had named every member of her family, her expression changed. She insisted that wasn't possible. Growing uneasy, she asked me not to tell the other employees to avoid spreading fear. Then I told her about the lights flickering, but she didn't believe me. To prove it, I asked her to check the cafe's security footage. She hesitated, but eventually pulled up the recordings on her phone. Her face paled as she watched. She didn't see the lights go out, but she did see the women entering the cafe, and then they were gone. There was no footage of them leaving. Right after they appeared, the camera stopped recording. That night, I had nightmares and no longer wanted to return to work, but I had no choice. I needed the money. Time passed and everything returned to normal. Now I rarely think about that night. I'm still with my boyfriend. We've been together for a year, but I will never understand what really happened in that cafe. Story 3. I was born in Monterrey, and due to my good grades, I won a scholarship to study in Europe, specifically in the southeastern part of Italy on the coast. Unfortunately, things didn't go well with the university. I made friends with people involved in shady businesses, substances, and that sort of thing. One way or another, my friendship with those people led me to start selling pills within the university. I was expelled when I got caught. Those people, who despite being criminals were my friends, helped me get a job. You could say I was an exclusive taxi driver. It was a private company that was actually a very dark sect. Its members, though few, were extremely wealthy and came from different countries around the world. They had a special card that we, the drivers, used to identify them and provide them with transportation services. My friends were able to get me this job because they had contacts in Albania. In fact, they also found me a place to live. The events I am about to tell you may seem completely outside the realm of what one might consider remotely normal or even possible, but you must understand that Albania is a country controlled by mafias that run all kinds of illicit businesses. First, a bit of context so you can better understand what the situation in Albania was like when I arrived there to work and live. The disaster began with World War I. The entire country was used as a battleground for the confrontations between France and the Ottoman Empire. When the war ended, the country was divided into two parts. One was placed under Serbian control, while the other could be considered somewhat autonomous. That's why when I arrived, and even to this day, Serbian mafias have a strong influence in Albania's affairs. 10 years after World War I ended, the country became a monarchy. Then it suffered an Italian invasion, which culminated when the Italians decided who would remain as king. When World War II broke out, the Allies took advantage of the situation to arm Albanian dissidents so they could fight against the Italians. When the war ended, the Soviet Union, through a dictator, imposed communism in Albania. I arrived in Albania in the early months of 1998. At that time, the country had recently emerged from radical communism, but it had also gone through a civil war and severe cases of corruption. Because of this, once again, the Italian armed forces made their presence known in the country. All that chaos, confusion, and discontent led to socialism taking control of Albania, and a few months later, I arrived, surrounded by Albanian mafias, socialist repression, and Italian military forces. The country was a disaster. Anything illegal had a place there, and precisely the sect I worked for was involved in shady dealings. My first day on the job was intense. For starters, some rough-looking people came to the place where I was staying. Before I could start working for them, they wanted to ask me a few questions. I answered everything and passed that filter. At that moment, I didn't know it, but those people had already investigated me. They just wanted to see if I would be honest. We left the building, got into the car they had arrived in, and went to an old abandoned factory. There were more members of the sect there. I should clarify that I spoke English well, and all the sect members and their contacts spoke English too, so language was never an issue. The sect members explained to me that before becoming a full member, I had to work for them for 8 months, after which they would consider initiating me. I found that strange. I had absolutely no intention of joining their sect, but apparently that's what my friends told them to get me the job. The sect members explained that my job would be very simple. Drive from point A to point B, ask no questions, pretend not to know anything about what I saw and heard, and most importantly, not ask any questions. I accepted their conditions. One of them pulled out a handgun and tossed it to me. I caught it, not because I wanted to, but because I was afraid that if it hit the ground, it might go off by accident. They explained that the gun was part of a batch that was going to be sent to Bosnia through Montenegro. If I went to the police, my fingerprints were already on a weapon that was part of the black market arms trade. After that warning, they gave me a Mercedes, which had clearly been stolen from another country, possibly from Croatia or Hungary, because both bordered Serbia, and that's where the cars came from. That first day, I obviously didn't fully grasp what the hell I was getting myself into, but things became a little clearer after my first trip. I received a call. The cell phone had been given to me by the sect. They gave me an address. I entered it into the Mercedes' GPS and I drove. I was in Tirana, the capital of Albania. The person who called wanted me to pick him up from Rinas International Airport. Since it was my first trip, I remember perfectly that the airport was 25 kilometers away from my location. I arrived at the airport, parked the Mercedes, and shortly after, a man appeared. He was in his 30s, thin with light skin, wearing dark sunglasses. His beard was prominent, his hair was short, and his face showed almost no expression. He was dressed in a light blue suit with a white tie. He showed me the card that identified him as a member of the sect. By the way, this card included neither a name nor an alias. The card only contained 3 things: a photo, the member code, which was like an ID, and nationality. That's how I knew this man was from Romania. This man already knew I was Mexican. Everyone in the sect knew. That way, if I did something inconvenient for the sect, they would all know how to find me and my family. This person, whom I will refer to as the Romanian, asked me to take him to an apartment complex in the Kerbin district. I stayed in the car, waiting for the Romanian to return. Not long after, I saw something unsettling. Across the street, a Mercedes almost identical to mine pulled into an alley, and several rough-looking men entered. If you ask me, something related to substance trafficking was happening there. Then I saw something that made me feel uncomfortable and nervous. A bus arrived, and several young women dressed in pink robes stepped off and entered the same building. They were lined up. The robes covered their entire bodies except for their faces, from head to toe. They were praying. An elderly woman led them, and another elderly woman followed at the end, watching over them. 3 hours passed. First, the elderly women and the young girls left, got on the bus, and left. Then, other people exited the building. They all had the same expression on their faces. I wouldn't know how to describe it, but just by looking at them, including the Romanian, it was clear they had all killed at least one person. Death was in their eyes. Finally, the Romanian came out, but he was accompanied by one of the young women in the pink robes. They both got into the car, and I drove them to the Serbian border, what is now known as Kosovo. When we arrived, another vehicle was already waiting for us. The Romanian and the young woman got out and approached the car. The Romanian greeted those in the vehicle warmly. They opened the back door, and the young woman got in. The Romanian returned to the car and told me to take him to one of the sect's safe houses in the Mat district. When I arrived, there were other sect drivers. We were all parked behind the safe house.